From the mind of the legendary Wes Craven, 1984 introduced horror fans to A Nightmare on Elm Street, and of course the nefarious, underhand, creepy as all hell Freddy Krueger, with the success of that movie causing New Line Cinema to be known affectionately as the house that Freddy built. All of these years later, we've had a multitude of sequels, a questionable remake, and even a crossover with the Friday the 13th franchise. But how do those Elm Street outings truly stack up? So with that in mind, I'm Andrew from What Culture Horror, and here's every A Nightmare on Elm Street movie ranked worst to best. Of course, before we get going with this is a subjective matter, so please let us know your thoughts in the comments. Number 9. A Nightmare on Elm Street. 2010. Remaking a classic of yesteryear is always a fairly bold move. Stick too faithfully to the original, and a remake can be deemed utterly pointless. Bring too many fresh ideas to the table, you'll be berated for veering too far away from that previous movie. With the 2010 A Nightmare on Elm Street though, we got the worst kind of remake. A totally soulless, bland, formulaic, and miserable remake. Jackie Earle Haley was as good a choice as any to replace Robert Englund as Freddy Krueger, but the dour tone of this remake means his Freddy lacks the playfulness of Englund's. Of course, Englund's Freddy did become way too playful at times, but the 2010 Freddy and the 2010 Elm Street period were just so dark and broody, and not in a good way. With Rooney Mara, Kyle Gallner, Katie Cassidy, Connie Britton, and Clancy Brown, Jackie Earle Haley was joined by quite the impressive ensemble. The problem is, all of those characters were just so vanilla and dull. Number 8. A Nightmare on Elm Street 5. The Dream Child. The Dream Child has the dubious honour of having the biggest budget in the franchise until that point in time, while simultaneously bringing home the lowest box office. Quite the accolade there you've got. So bad was Elm Street 5, New Line decided the only way the franchise could move forward after this was to officially kill off Freddy Krueger. Even director Stephen Hopkins labelled The Dream Child a total embarrassment. The Dream Child did actually have some great special effects work, but the wider plot, as in Freddy using the dreams of an unborn child to wreak havoc, was just a bit, well, naff really. Added to that, the performances of our central protagonists range from just about passable to outright awful, and we had yet another example of Freddy Krueger leaning way too much into comedy to make him feel like a truly menacing presence. The use of certain gothic imagery brought something a little spooky to Elm Street 5, but those striking visuals were not enough to save a film that made Freddy's backstory even more convoluted. And while the kills here were fun, there were sadly only 3 of them. Number 7. A Nightmare on Elm Street 2. Freddy's Revenge. Freddy's Revenge stands out like a sore thumb when compared to the rest of the Elm Street franchise. Here, Freddy Krueger doesn't kill people in their dreams, but instead possesses poor Jesse Walsh and for the most part uses Jesse to do his killing. Considering Wes Craven refused to return to direct Elm Street 2 due to his unhappiness with the script, that should be one red flag. Likewise, Craven had intended for A Nightmare on Elm Street to be a one-and-done movie, rather than for it to ever receive a sequel or to spawn a franchise. Famously, it was producer Bob Shaye who forcibly tacked on the final shot of the first film to leave the door open for a follow-up. Speaking of Shaye, he also stupidly thought Robert Englund was disposable and merely your standard villain-for-hire movie monster, the producer choosing to use a stuntman in a plastic Freddy mask when Elm Street 2 started production. Of course, it didn't take long for the powers to be to realise their error and the begging basket to go out to Robert Englund. Number 6. Freddy's Dead. The Final Nightmare. So bad was The Dream Child, the only way New Line could realistically serve up another Elm Street movie was on the promise that it was a farewell to the series. Freddy's Dead The Final Nightmare was indeed intended to be the end, with Freddy Krueger being truly banished once and for all. So much so, the marketing for Freddy's Dead saw a public, promotional funeral held for Springwood's most infamous son. By now, the Elm Street franchise was about knowing cheesy slapstick comedy more than actual terror. And that's shown in so much of The Final Nightmare, not least in that Wicked Witch parody, or the video game death of Breckin Meyer's Stoner Spencer. Then there's the larger plot of the whodunit style mystery over who is secretly Freddy's offspring. Likely most pleasing for franchise fans though is Rachel Talalay making her directing debut here, with Talalay having worked her way through the ranks, starting as a production assistant on the very first Elm Street. Number 5. A Nightmare on Elm Street 4. The Dream Master. Elm Street 3 Dream Warriors steadied the ship after the poorly received Freddy's Revenge, but A Nightmare on Elm Street 4 The Dream Master undid so much of what made Dream Warriors work so well. While Dream Warriors shockingly killed off franchise fave Nancy Thompson, this series moved forward with a new set of heroes, that'd be Kristen, Kincaid and Joey, the so-called last of the Elm Street kids. Nancy was gone, but this trio was solid characters who you could get behind for Elm Street 4. Well, until Kincaid and Joey are killed off just 20 minutes in, and Kristen bites the bullet shortly after, the film then switching its focus to newcomer Alice Johnson. Not only does Alice take on Kristen's dream powers, but she also picks up the abilities of each of her friends who were murdered by Freddy Krueger, leaving Alice to take Freddy down for good, or, until he resurfaced just 1 year later in The Dream Child. Nightmare 4 is a solid film with some great kill sequences. And while it was disappointing to see the Dream Warriors survivors pushed to one side, Lisa Wilcox's Alice was great at portraying the shy, timid teenager who discovers the strength and belief to battle against the odds. Number 4. Freddy vs. Jason. Many had dreamt of seeing Freddy Krueger and Jason Voorhees butt heads from the moment Krueger first appeared in 1984, and it didn't take long for the minds behind those two franchises to likewise think about bringing these two titans together. It took until the aftermath of 1989's Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan, for things to really get going though, as that's when Paramount lost the rights to the Friday the 13th IP. Still, it was another 14 years before Freddy vs. Jason finally arrived in cinemas. Directed by Ronnie Yu, that 2003 Battle of the Behemoths nicely intertwined the two franchises, with Freddy taking on the form of Jason's mother in order to have Voorhees slaughter the teens of Springwood in a way to make the town remember Freddy, in turn allowing Freddy to once again embark on his own bloody revenge. Of course, this working arrangement eventually goes south, and these two horror icons have one final showdown for the ages. While Freddy vs. Jason is a fun popcorn slasher, one element that irked many longtime fans was Ken Kirzinger replacing franchise fave Kane Hodder as Jason. So while we did get Freddy Krueger vs. Jason Voorhees, there was a tinge of sadness at not seeing Robert Englund vs. Kane Hodder. Number 3. Wes Craven's New Nightmare. So much for 1991's Freddy's Dead, the final nightmare being particularly final. The caveat here, of course, is that 1994's Wes Craven's New Nightmare doesn't technically have Freddy Krueger as its villain. Instead, the threat of the day here is merely known as the Entity, though it does take on the physical appearance of Freddy Krueger. With Craven back to direct for the first time since the original Elm Street, the legendary filmmaker took a meta approach with New Nightmare, delivering a movie set in the real world and where the Elm Street series exists as in-universe films. This entity figure begins to stalk those involved in the making of the Elm Street films. New Nightmare was a brilliant, clever return to form for the property, with Craven using this entity to revert Freddy Krueger, in finger quotes, back to a genuinely chilling presence. Number 2. A Nightmare on Elm Street 3. Dream Warriors! Oh, I can't not sing it every time that comes up, but I will try and do my best here. Because Dream Warriors, it can consider itself extremely unfortunate not to have nabbed the top spot on this list in this video. After the hugely disappointing Freddy's Revenge in 1985, Dream Warriors rolled around 2 years later to get the franchise back on track, complete with Wes Craven contributing to the story and screenplay due to how outright unhappy he was with Elm Street 2. Much like Craven was back involved for this Chuck Russell directed threequel, so too was Heather Langenkamp as Nancy Thompson, with Nancy now working as a therapist at Western Hills Psychiatric Hospital, where she helps the last of the Elm Street kids against Freddy Krueger. An all-time great horror sequel, Dream Warriors, complete with the absolutely badass title song from Dokken, served as a passing of the torch as Nancy bows out to allow Kristen, Kincaid and Joey to lead the franchise forward. Well, of course, until those early kills in Elm Street 4, that is. Dream Warriors had to be a success if the franchise was to recover from Freddy's Dead, and it certainly did the job in that regard, being legitimately terrifying, having likely the best kills of the entire series, and featuring a bunch of characters you are fully invested in. Number 1. A Nightmare on Elm Street, 1984. Wes Craven had already put himself on the horror map with The Last House on the Left and The Hills Have Eyes, but 1984's A Nightmare on Elm Street took the writer-director to an entirely different level. Reading a very real story of people mysteriously dying in their sleep, Craven took that concept and ran with it to create the dream-stalking, child-killing Freddy Krueger. And by the end of that first film, Freddy was already thrust into the upper echelon of horror villains. It wasn't just Freddy Krueger that made Elm Street stand out from the pack though, for Heather Langkamp's Nancy Thompson made for a great protagonist. Plus, the fictional town of Springwood felt like an entity in and of itself, much like Haddonfield in Halloween and Camp Crystal Lake in Friday the 13th. Then there's the backstory of the parents of Elm Street partaking in vigilante justice to burn Krueger alive, which adds a history of trauma to the town while also giving Freddy motivation for his present day acts. Throw in some truly genius, often ooey-gooey death sequences and a smart, sharp script, and A Nightmare on Elm Street remains to this very day a timeless classic.